A warm welcome to our webinar on Latin American Governance Challenge. My name is Irene Mia. I'm Senior Fellow for Latin America at the IISS. Our Latin American program provides fresh thinking and original research on the region's main security, governance, socioeconomic, and geopolitical challenges. Topics we have covered in our program include the geopolitics of organized crime, Latin America in the global order, main threats to domestic and regional stability, including climate change. Our program supports the formulation of national and regional policies to improve domestic and regional resilience and stability. And we are holding those webinars also to support those goals and those aims. Today's session will focus on the crisis of governance increasingly apparent in Latin America at many levels, at the domestic level, at the regional level, and also at the pan-regional level. The multiple governance crises have been in full display in the 9th Summit of the Americas, which the US has hosted a couple of weeks ago, at the beginning of June in Los Angeles, with the deterioration of democratic standards in the region taking central stage, and also feeding into regional friction and calls for reforms of the current regional political and institutional framework. The summit highlighted the lack of cohesion and governance shortcomings at the regional level, but also the limitation of the current Latin American US governance framework. At the core of this complex governance crisis, one can say there is really a crisis of trust at many levels, the same level we have highlighted earlier on. So mistrust at the domestic level for mainstream politicians and politics, as well as institutions which are seen as incapable or unwilling to address society needs, most pressing demands. Mistrust then often opens the door in the region for populism, deterioration in democratic standards, and also really open the door sometimes even more worryingly for criminal groups to really gain legitimacy with local population and provide a structure of local governance which overlaps often with the legal governance structure. Mistrust also at the regional level with a lack of common voice, of shared agenda for the region, and also failure or shortcoming or stagnation in regional fora, agreements and organization. Also decreasing intra-regional trade, which is another reflection of that. And also a mistrust and governance crisis, which prevent the region to present a unified front and approach to very pressing global and regional challenges, such as the post-COVID recovery, Venezuela crisis, uncontrolled migrations, organized crime, and climate vulnerability. Finally, mistrust towards the US, which, coupled with China rising economic statecraft and more assertive foreign policy towards the region, lead to a vacuum of leadership many times and progress on key challenges for the Western Hemisphere and the world, including climate security, protecting the Amazons, addressing transnational illicit economies and flows, and also really migration, which is at the heart of so many crises on the border between Mexico and the US. We will try to unpack all those very complex challenges and very complicated pictures and discuss also possible way forwards with a stellar panel of speakers, which I will introduce now in order of appearance, starting with Dr. Carlos Scartaccini, who is head of the Development Research Group and leader of the Behavioral Economics Groups at the Inter-American Development Bank. Carlos has published 8 books and more than 60 articles in academic journals and edited volumes. He's also a member of the Executive Committee of IDB Gender and Diversity Lab. He's a member of the Board of Advisor of the Master of Behavioral and Decision Science at the University of Pennsylvania. And he's also associate editor of the academic journal Economia, and also founding member of LACEA Brain. We're also joined today by Dr. Elizabeth Zechmeister, who is a Cornelius Vanderbilt Professor of Political Science. She's also the director of the LAPOP lab at Vanderbilt University. Her research focuses on comparative political behavior and public opinion, in particular in Latin America. Her work includes studies of voting, ideology, political parties, representation, charisma, and crisis. Liz has received support from the National Science Foundation for an investigation into the public opinion consequences of terrorist threat and natural disasters, which is a really interesting project. She has also published many articles in the American Journal of Political Science, the Journal of Politics, Comparative Political Studies, and Political Behavior, among other outlets. We're also joined from Buenos Aires by Dr. Federico Merke. Federico is Associate Professor of International Relations at Sant Andres University in Buenos Aires. He is also a researcher at the National Council for Scientific Research and a professor at the Foreign Service Institute at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Argentina. His research focuses on Latin American foreign policy and regional cooperation, as well as geopolitical risk and climate change. And finally, we're joined by Dr. Mónica Serrano, who is a research professor of international relations at the Colegio de Mexico. She's also a senior fellow at the Ralph Bunche Institute, a senior research associate at the Center for International Studies in Oxford University. She's also one of our own associate fellows, the Latin American program here at the IISS. We're very happy to have her on the webinar. She's also in the UK in this month. Monica's research focuses on international relations of Latin America and North America, with particular reference to international institutions, security, human rights, and transnational crime. She has published several books, articles, and book chapters on international institutions, human rights, and drug policy. So we have a fantastic, as I said, panel of experts with covering the different dimensions we have mentioned, domestic, regional, and pan-regional level. But before we start, just some quick housekeeping rules. We will start with a round of introductory remarks by the speakers. We'll then follow with a discussion, which we would like to be as interactive and inclusive as possible. So please, if you could add your question or comment on the Q&A box in the chat, we will pick them up in the course of the panel and also in the Q&A section at the end of the webinar. With that, let's get the conversation started. Carlos, I'd like to start with you, if I may. You recently published and co-authored a very interesting book on trust in Latin America, where you made the case for making trust a goal of public policy in Latin America as a way to accelerate growth, employment, and progress in the region. Could you please set the scene for us for the conversation we are going to have? Can you tell us what is the importance of trust for good governance and well-functioning society? And some of the findings of the book, especially in terms of way forward, how do we create this trust in the region?
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Irene. Thanks, Liz, Federico, Monica, and everybody at IISS. It's a pleasure for me to be in here. And let me talk a little bit about the book, and set the stage, as you were saying. So the first thing is that, how do we define trust? And the way we define trust is the belief that others will not act opportunistically. So that others will not take advantage of you. When we talk about others, we talk about individuals, we talk about firms, we talk about the government. And the reason why this slide is in front of you, first of all, it's just a marketing plot, so you can see the book and you can go and download the book. But I think that it exemplifies well what I'm going to be talking about today, about the role of trust in order to build these strong societies, these strong democracies, democracies in which populism is not leading the way, but societies in which we are all building together for better public goods and stronger democratic institutions. So one of the things that we have in the book, and I'm going to be talking about, is that we have a crisis of trust. When we look at the data coming from the Integrated Value Survey, the World Values, which is a combination of the Value Survey and some of the barometers. So basically, only one in 10 people in Latin America basically say that they can trust others. So in other words, 9 out of 10 say that they cannot be, careful enough with dealing with others. And again, we're talking about individuals, we're talking about firms. So as you can imagine, it's very difficult to build very strong societies when people don't trust each other. Particularly regarding the topic that we care about today, if people don't trust each other, they will not do these small sacrifices that we all need to do in order to build this, these societies, those acts of citizenship, as we call them. Alexis de Tocqueville talked about this, more than a century ago. Robert Putnam, closer in time. But basically, this idea that in order to build a strong society, we need to do these small sacrifices. Vote, go out, hold governments accountable, recycle, do not litter, and those small things. And we can clearly, we don't do those. We don't participate in political parties. We don't go and control the voting, during the elections, etc. If you don't trust that others will do it. Quite on the contrary, we are going to act atomized. We are not going to participate in the public sphere. We have a lot of data, from very simple exercises, experiments we have done, such as when you don't have a trust in society, people, if they find a wallet on the street, they are not going to return it. Okay, they are going to keep it by themselves. If they don't trust others, they will not recycle. If they don't trust others, they will not pay their taxes. If they don't trust others, they will not, go to the police and, tell the police that they, they have witnessed a crime, or, etc., etc. So again, all of those small acts that build a strong society. And the problem is that when you don't have citizenship, there are two things that are not going to happen. So one is that you are not going to demand public goods. Okay. So basically what you are going to do is you are going to enter in very individual transactions. And that's unfortunately what we see today in Latin America. In Latin America, public spending has doubled in most of the countries at least. But we don't see an equivalent increase in the provision of public goods. We don't see an equivalent increase in public education, in safety, in citizen security, and so on and so forth. What we see is a lot of people trying to retrench from the government, trying to provide their own education, their own health, their own security, get into behind walls, segregate, etc., not pay their taxes. Okay, so clearly, if we don't demand the public goods, we are not going to receive the public goods. And quite on the contrary, what we see is that a lot of these individual transactions, in which people are asking for subsidies, just so you have all of these webs of transfers in which everybody pays whatever they want in taxes, and they just basically transfer away, part to the middle class, part to the upper class, part to the lower class, but it's just a web of transfers, in which each individual enters into individual transactions. But even more so, regarding the main topic of conversation today, people don't build institutions. People don't ask for stronger institutions. We don't ask for a stronger judiciary. Actually, we care a lot about having individual relationships with the local judge in order to make sure that we are safe. But we are not thinking about, strong and independent judiciaries. We are not thinking about strong and independent and programmatic parties. We are not thinking about very strong bureaucracies that can lead the way. Again, we're asking for a lot of regulation, but not complying with the regulation at the same time. So just to wrap up, then, we have a crisis of trust. We don't trust each other. So as such, we are not willing to make the small sacrifices that build these strong societies, and then we are not willing to demand and act upon those in order to build, very, very strong institutions that we need to move forward. There are ways out of it, but we can talk about in the Q&A. Thank you, Irene.
Thank you, Carlos, and we're looking forward to actually discuss what are the ways that you have identified to build trust. But let's move to really try to unpack a little bit what this trust, what this mistrust actually means at the local, at the national, at the regional, and the pan-regional level for governance and for a strong institution. If I could move to you, could you help us understand the governance crisis ongoing at the domestic level in Latin America? And also the repercussion in terms of rising populism, polarization, political fragmentation. What are the main insights of the latest La Pop Americas barometers, which I think was really quite interesting in highlighting those aspects?
Okay, great. Thanks so much. Happy to be here. Thanks for having me, and hi to everyone who's here as a participant as well. I'm going to continue on this theme of trust. and focus in particular on political trust. Because as the title suggests, this is an area where I think there's a particularly critical challenge in the region that emerges from a combination of high levels of distrust in politics along various dimensions, and yet a desire for voice in politics. So sort of dissatisfaction combined with sort of a sense of betrayal or frustration, leading to a tolerance or even a preference for strong executives who will, in theory, override standard electoral processes and elected officials. So if you go to the next slide, I'm just going to highlight, as Carlos did, a little bit of a plug and say something about where the data come from. So the data that I'm going to present today come from La Pop's America's Barometer project. This is a regular survey that covers most of the Western Hemisphere with a common core and a standardized set of methods. While the project is typically conducted using face-to-face interviews, we conducted the 2021 America's Barometer round in the LAC region by phone. Now, given widespread mobile phone coverage and with the use of weights for additional adjustments, we were able to generate nationally representative samples with which we can make comparisons across countries and across time. And then these data and the reports that are based on them that we've developed are freely available on our project website. Go to the next slide. These are the 4 takeaways from the data that I'll share with you today. And these data that I'll share today are just the tip of the iceberg, but I think they present one story that we should be paying particular attention to. So first, when we look at support for democracy, we see that support for democracy remains stable, but at comparatively low levels. Second, perceptions of corruption remain high, including with respect to concerns about the integrity of electoral processes. In fact, trust in elections is so weak that when given the opportunity to trade away elections for a better standard of living, many express a willingness to do so. Yet the same is not true for freedom of expression. Here we see a strong preference for having voice in the political system. So where does that lead in terms of currents in public opinion? One answer is to increased tolerance or even preference for centralization of power in the executive office. In short, in a situation in which the public holds clear reservations about the capacity of elected officials to deliver, and the public likewise desires voice in politics, the public shows increased willingness to give up the to give the president a mandate to override electoral processes and elected bodies. So let me take a sort of a tour through these data to give you a sense of what they look like. So on the next slide, you'll see the proportion of the public on average in the Latin American and Caribbean region that expresses support for democracy. So you can interpret this slide as showing you the percent of the public in an average country in the region, as a theoretical average, that expresses support for democracy. About 5 years ago, support dropped significantly, and it's remained at that comparatively lower level since then. You see a slight uptick in 2021, but it's really at the margins. And in this case, I may be driven a bit by the use of phones to conduct this survey, where we found that people tended to sort of move a little bit more towards the endpoints of certain scaled items. So you see that uptick may be more of an artifact than a real thing. When we look at just means on support for democracy across the years, we see no difference between 2021 and the 2 prior rounds. So I would consider this sort of a plateau that we're stuck at in the region. Now, this slide does not show us cross-national variation, which is present, and I don't have time to go into detail today, but I'll just say that if you were to look at this across countries, you would see that support for democracy is highest in Uruguay and lowest in Haiti. Now, in the next slide, you'll see that at the same time that we see this kind of stable and comparatively low support for democracy, we also see stability in persistent widespread concerns about the extent of corruption in politics among elected officials. At the bottom of each slide is the question wording, And here we're asking people to report on the extent to which they see corruption among public officials. And you can see that on average, about 2/3 of the public sees corruption as being widespread in politics. And then on the next slide, if we look at this with respect to elections specifically, here we're getting a lot of data because I'm showing you country level data. We see that there are significant concerns about the integrity of elections. So for instance, on this slide, when we ask people if the rich buy elections, one form of sort of corruption in the electoral process, we see high levels of concerns about the integrity of elections in most countries. In fact, so here we're seeing that large proportions of the public report that it's always the case that the rich buy elections. And particularly striking here is Paraguay, where 64% of adults believe that the rich always buy elections. And on the next slide, when we ask about ballot secrecy, we likewise see substantial portions of the public in every country believe that politicians can sometimes, that sort of middle color, or always find out how one votes. Now, another way on the next slide to assess public opinion on elections is to ask people to consider a trade-off. So in this case, we asked people to consider a trade-off between a system that has elections or a system that guarantees minimum basic income and services. And what you can see on this slide here is that in the majority of countries, the majority of individuals would accept a guarantee of a minimum standard of living over a guarantee of elections. So in short, when the public loses confidence in elections, they also lose the will to champion elections as an integral component of their political system. And yet, on the next slide, when asked about a similar trade-off, but this time with respect to freedom of expression, so in other words, the ability to talk about politics without fear or censorship, the pattern is reversed. Here, majorities are unwilling to give up voice for material well-being. So the public desires voice, but has high levels of concern that elections are an adequate mechanism to translate that voice into politics. So on the next slide, you'll see one sort of answer to the question of where does that combination of distrust and desire for voice lead? And as I indicated earlier, what we are seeing in the region is an increasing tolerance for what Nancy Bermeo calls executive aggrandizement. Here seen in a tolerance for maneuvers by the executive to remove checks and balances by overriding Congress. So you can see a pretty steep increase beginning in 2016-17 in that round of the Americas barometer, continuing upward, and in fact, effectively surging in 2021 up to 30% of the public on average, thinking that in times of crisis, it's reasonable for the executive to shut Congress and govern without it. And if we look at the next slide, we can see this across countries. You can see that the level of tolerance is highest in El Salvador. So that's the country far to the left. And that's important to note because one of the things that we see in practice is that this type of public opinion dynamic can embolden leaders. So for example, we see this high level of support or tolerance for executive aggrandizement in El Salvador. And that level that we see in 2021, which I'm showing you here, is a significant jump in the country from the prior round of the Americas barometer. And what we see in the country these days is the president is doing exactly that, behaving as an aggrandized executive, overriding checks and balances, intimidating Congress, and so on. So there are clear reasons to be concerned about the ways in which these public opinion dynamics embolden leaders and translate into the types of populist dynamics that champions of democracy have reasons to be concerned about. Another way to say this is that to the degree that the public sees the system as seriously flawed, opinion shifts in ways that increase the leeway that entrepreneurial executives have to weaken democracy from the inside out. And that's not a new story. It's a story that's offered by a good deal of scholarship on democratic erosion on populism. What we see here is it playing out in real time in the Americas barometer data. So we're sort of taking the theory and connecting the dots empirically together. So just to conclude, and you can go to the last slide, which is kind of returns to advertising. This is our report on the 2021 America's Barometer you can find on our website. We have a crisis of confidence in the region. Our levels of trust in elected officials and electoral systems are low, and this is opening the door or fueling a tolerance for strong executives. And so this points to the need to strengthen institutions to restore trust in standard democratic processes. And I'm going to stop there and turn it back to our moderator.
Thanks, Liz. That's, I mean, the data are quite telling. I think it's really interesting how, in a way, you know, we heard a lot about crisis of democracy, but it is true that it's maybe some type of some crisis of some part of democracy, right? Because there is still this kind of seems to be still this kind of appetite for freedom of expression. So I think it's something that we should discuss later on in the Q&A. I have a number of questions in that respect. But let's move from the domestic level to the regional and pan-regional level. And look a little bit at this governance crisis at those two levels. Now, this is actually affecting coherent approaches and also solution to transnational problems. If I may, I would like to start with Mónica, looking really at the more pan-regional US, Latin American governance crisis and challenges there. Mónica, what are the trends and outlook for addressing some of those pressing kind of, I would say, transnational, Pan-American, but also really international challenges such as uncontrolled migration flows, drug trafficking, and also the rise of China, which is something that it's also altering a little bit the dynamics in the region.
Thank you, Irene, and thank you for the invitation again. It is a great pleasure to share the floor with all of you in this very timely discussion. I think it is very clear, and we just had the evidence from the Summit of the Americas in Los Angeles, that the region confronts a deficit of leadership, a clear deficit of leadership, but also an institutional deficit. The institutions that were there and played a somehow important role in the past, clearly the Organization of American States has played a very controversial role, and the person leading the Organization of American States, Almagro, has been the object of very acute criticisms, the role played in Venezuela and in other crises. And then we have the Summit of the Americas itself that took place in Los Angeles just at the start of June, which was a complicated proposition to start with, given the controversial proposal of the Biden administration to turn the strengthening of democratic rule in a key part of the agenda, and how in doing that, then the issue of participation became a very controversial part of the conversation, prompting a number of countries, including Mexico and President López Obrador, very early on in May, to question the decision of the Biden administration not to invite all of the countries in the region, with Cuba having previously been invited in 2015 in the Summit of the Americas in that year. This, I think, decision to made of the strengthening of democratic rule a priority for the agenda and leading to the exclusion of countries proved to be, I think, perhaps not a very wise decision at times when the region is and has been facing depolarization and a very acute ideological divide between countries led or divided or polarized along the right-left divide. I think there are two conclusions that we can draw from this. One is the very little achievements in terms of tackling the challenge of bringing together a very divided and polarized region. And the second is the very poor leadership, given the very modest way and very minimal proposals that the US put together or offered at the summit, and the way in which, more to the point, these proposals simply replay old ideas in new wine bottles. And these ideas, again, speak to the very deep divide that still, I think, runs in the region, and that set apart the US clearly from Mexico. The Mexican president has again, and in the course of conversations with President Biden, just before the summit, the Mexican president alluded to the differences, that there was agreement perhaps in the diagnosis, in the need to address the root causes, but there was a very clear difference in terms of the solutions. And the solutions that the US offered are basically more of the same. Even if we accept that there is a bit of a change in the narrative, there are no radical differences in terms of how these problems have been tackled in the past, or how they are being addressed in the present. We have just a few days ago, the Minister of Foreign Affairs from Chile, Antonia Urrejola, I think rightly so, addressing the urgent need to find a common voice in the region to tackle problems that cannot be resolved unilaterally, that need the concert of all regions, of all countries in the region, and the need for bridges to try to build bridges to try to go over this ideological divide that separates countries. The recent elections, I think, the election in Colombia, above all, perhaps will offer new voices and fresh, the Chilean government as well, I think, together with Colombia, may provide fresh voices to try to find these bridges that will allow the region to come together. There is also a very interesting article in the New York Times today pointing to the role the US ambassador has played in Mexico, Ken Salazar, that I think speaks precisely to the theme that the proposal that you put together for this webinar highlights, and that is how the polarization and the crisis of governance at the domestic level travels and translates at the external level. The article describes very briefly the difficult role, the very difficult role that the US ambassador has been forced to play as he confronts the AMLO administration, a nationalist administration, very ideologically driven, and how the ambassador has tried to offer responses and to try to get the Mexican government to address questions such as the rollback on the energy reform, the decision to instead go back to fossil and a state-led agenda on oil development, the total lack of interest of the Mexican government on initiatives and policies related to climate change, not to mention the controversial policies on security and drug trafficking, and the need to enlist Mexico's cooperation to contain migration. The approach followed by the US ambassador has been one of trying to intensify the contacts with the Mexican government and Mexican actors, including state governors and the business sector, But the result has been that, as the article in the New York Times suggests today, the ambassador has been deeply criticized for having been, is being perceived as having been co-opted by the AMLO administration. I think that as the US ambassador failed in his efforts to persuade the López Obrador, President López Obrador, to attend the summit, I think it highlights both the challenges that the region faces, both as governments face the question of polarization internally, the question of lack of trust, the way in which executives, including the Mexican executive, have amassed power and authority, but also the urgent need to tackle and address questions of security that are clearly affecting the region, as the Foreign Minister of Chile, Antonia Urrejola, highlighted, whether it's drug trafficking, whether it's migration. And it is clear that the old responses are not working. As the president of the Truth Commission of Colombia highlighted just again a few days ago in an interview in El País, drug trafficking is at the center of Colombia's insecurity, but I would say of the region's insecurity. And while drug trafficking stays in place, it will be very difficult for Colombia or Mexico, by the way, to find a path to peace. And whether it is migration or drug trafficking, it is clear that the old responses are not working. The US has come with, in terms of migration, in the Summit of the Americas, with proposals that speak to the need to address economic development. But we know that when it comes to migration or drug trafficking, the reality is that the need for a more radical reform agenda is absolutely clear. So I'll stop there and I can come back later on in questions and answers.
Thanks, Monica. That was a fantastic, actually, overview of all the challenges and all the really pressing issues that, you know, for which we would need better governance at the domestic and global level. But moving now to you, Federico, more obviously, Monica has already touched upon some of the challenges and some of the, I would say the main challenge really, which is this kind of really fragmented also Latin America. What is your view? What is the outlook for really for regional cooperation and really for addressing, for finding a common voice on those challenges, transnational challenges, and much more?
Yes, thank you, Irene, for this invitation. For me, it is also a pleasure to be here, there, in the cloud, wherever, with you, and to be able to listen to excellent colleagues. I will try to get to the point and make a presentation as concise as possible, so we have some time for the questions and discussion. And to put it very simply, my most important headline is, going to your question, is that the larger trend in Latin America is towards fragmentation, not integration. And I think that there are at least 6 reasons that lead me to this conclusion. First of all, in terms of trade, one reason has to do with the decline in intra-regional trade, with more and more countries exporting more to the US, to the European Union, and to China, mainly China, in particular in South America, than to their own neighbors. So this falling interdependence reduces very much incentives for cooperation and generates a dynamic that is more centrifugal than centripetal in the region. Secondly, as Monica suggested, the region does not have the necessary leaders or the leadership.
We seem to have lost Federico, but hopefully we come back.
I can, well, if he comes back, I can fill in. I think that traditionally, and the summits of the Americas have shown this, that given the asymmetries in the region, historically, it has been very difficult to find a basis for a common agenda. And with China now being part of the scene, the stage has been further complicated. And if in the past it was difficult to bring together the Latin American interest with the US interest, now with another external actor being part of the scene, the challenges are clearly have doubled or tripled.
And just as we wait for Federico to come back, on the China angle, Monica, which we haven't really addressed so far, how is it going to change actually? Because obviously China is the US foreign policy towards the region has always been very much based on the promotion of democracy and really trying to export those kind of value. China doesn't seem to be so bothered in that respect, and also in terms of his approach to the different countries of the region is quite different. How do you think it's going to impact also all this problem that you have mentioned earlier on, the problem from really addressing organized crime, particularly in security? Is it going to have a stance on that? Is it going to, I mean, as we know, China is obviously involved in some of the drug trafficking, especially for synthetic drugs and fentanyl. How do you see that? I mean,
I think in terms of drug trafficking, China has, in fact, a very pro-prohibitionist approach. And if we look at what were the voices in the 2016 General Assembly Special Session on Drugs, it was very clear that both China and Russia stuck to a very prohibitionist agenda. China has also very significantly tightened up the controls around fentanyl. And apparently in the case of Mexico, for instance, which is from where the fentanyl entering the US is now being clearly tracked, apparently China's imports into Mexico have declined and imports from India have increased. But we'll go back to Federico.
I'm back. I'm sorry. I don't know what happened.
Yeah, we were like, what about the other 5 reasons?
The computer just went off. I'm so sorry.
Thanks for coming back, Federico. So, we were actually all ears for your
Yes, sorry. I was referring to the lack of leadership in the region to drive regional cooperation. That was my second reason. Neither AMLO in Mexico nor Bolsonaro in Brazil are leaders for me, from my perspective, interested in driving a regional conversation. And Alberto Fernandez, Argentina, is mired in too many domestic problems to invest in the region beyond what it has done so far. The third reason is that other countries that could contribute to the regional conversation today are going through very complex transition. And I am thinking of Boric's Chile, which has to approve a new constitution in September, and Petro's Colombia, which has just won a few days ago, and we still do not know exactly what the direction of its foreign policy will be. Fourth, as Monica just said, the growing polarization in these and other countries makes it very difficult to establish long-term consensuses, such as those required for regional cooperation. In this sense, polarization reduces the time horizon with which we think about our relations with our neighbors. So in this context, the shadow of the future, as we say in game theory, seems to be getting shorter and shorter, and this takes away incentives for cooperation at the regional level. In this sense, polarization has generated from my perspective, a more ideological view of the relationship between neighbors. Governments are increasingly looking at each other through the lens of ideology and are betting that only governments with converging ideologies will have a chance of cooperating. And so here I want to go back to Carlos' remarks on the lack of trust. And a case could be made about the growing lack of trust among governments witnessing ideological distance. And this is very frustrating for me because it subjects the entire regional conversation to the existence of ideological convergence. And fifthly, support for leaders seems to be decreasing, and there is a kind of rejection of the incumbent parties in elections. Petro's victory in Colombia marked the 14th straight opposition victory in Latin America. So this trend seems to consume a lot of political capital and takes away attention from foreign policy issues. Last but not least, this is a long-term problem, a very structural problem, and it's a factor that has polarized the region, which has been the political, economic, and humanitarian crisis in Venezuela. For a long time, this crisis has absorbed a lot of diplomatic energy and is still an unresolved issue, probably the biggest failure in the region in years. So sure, everyone will say that regional cooperation is key, but let the other side take care of it. With all this pessimistic picture, there are, however, some reason to offer some optimism from my point of view. For example, we have not seen a war between states or a civil war for some time in the region. The region does not have nuclear weapons, nor does it have an authoritarian leader firing rockets into space and enriching uranium as Kim Jong-un does, or an authoritarian leader invading neighboring countries as Putin is doing today. Luckily, fundamentalist terrorism never gained a foothold in the region. Compared to Africa, our economies are more complex and our human capital is more prepared. And compared to Asia, our democracy is a bit stronger and our civil societies is more vibrant. So this is an important starting point for me because a region that can offer food and energy in a context of low geopolitical risk should be considered a higher value added region than it was considered 2 or 3 years ago. The problem here is that we do not yet know, how to continue this conversation. And we do not know have the venues to generate a modern, fresh discussion about our place in global geopolitics, in the changing globalization, or in the energy transitions, which are 3 fundamental issues for the future of the region. And I want to be clear in this, on this area. In my view, the imperative for Latin America should not be security, understood in interstate or geopolitical terms, but the imperative should be about growth. And the growth must be inclusive and sustainable. That, for me, is the Latin American imperative. And for it is essential to think about new globalization schemes, such as the export of knowledge-based services and digital trade in more general terms. I believe that Latin America has enormous potential there. The other potential lies in renewable energy. We have wind, we have sun, we have minerals, we have plenty of water, we have nuclear programs going on in several countries. And I think this gives us a lot of potential for the development of green hydrogen, for example, a fuel that will be in great demand around the world in the coming decade. And the other potential is in food, which is already a very much known sector. So I believe in these areas, the region can be more of a solution than a problem, even more so if all this is done in an area of low geopolitical risk. So where is the challenge here? The challenge is that the region doesn't have the regional venues to discuss these problems. We have organizations that deal with liberalization, in trade liberalization in broad terms, or democracy and human rights, or even hemispheric security. What I see here is a sort of disconnect between the existing regimes and the new issues that we need to coordinate better, such as climate action, energy transition, and digital trade. And yet, the task of regional cooperation should not be to invent everything anew. We like very much in Latin America, in every cycle to invent everything anew. And I don't think that's the way, nor should it be to create new organizations or reestablish anything. It should consist of seeking pragmatic consensus on these and other issues from the bottom up, from society to the state. So for the reason I have given at the start of my presentation, my recommendation would be something like this. Do not hold large meetings or propose any grand continental integration. Start with specific issues, small clubs of cooperation based on shared interests and coalition of the willing around very specific issues. This is not a time for big ideas, but rather a time for small, concrete actions. So I leave here my presentation and look forward for the Q&A session.
Thanks, Federico. No, that was great. Just we finish our round of remarks. So just to remind our audience if they have any question, but in the meantime, if you can write them in the box so we can see them. In the meantime, I have quite a lot of questions, and we've discussed so many different things that I think would be good to try and unpack some of what we have discussed. If I start in reverse order, so if I start again with Federico, you mentioned obviously that there is the need for, precisely what part of the equation. On one side, you actually highlighted the positive for which Latin America should be more important on the global table, right? The region where Latin America could really become more globally relevant because of the renewable energy, the commodities, the food, the critical mineral as well. So I guess you mentioned the fact that one of the issues for which there is no common approach or common or cohesive approach is really the lack sometimes of ideological convergence. And also you mentioned there is no leader that you think could actually, in a way, show the way to the region. So I have two questions in that respect. The first question is related to the fact that at the moment we do see some ideological convergence in the region, right? We have a leftist government in I think it's 13 countries in the region. We have Brazil probably going left as well. You may argue that it's very different type of left we're seeing across the region, but there is some convergence there. So that's one question. That's one issue. The other issue is that you mentioned there is no leader you think could take the lead on that. I would argue that, and that was also a question for Monica, that López Obrador has been increasingly taking a leadership position, be it on the Americas, on the Summit of the Americas, but also on the Venezuela crisis and negotiation. So my question is, and it's a double question. The first one is, do you think with this ideological convergence, it would be easier to actually get to some kind of concrete common position on the more kind of minimalist approach you mentioned? Or is it not enough convergence in the sense that there are so many different types of leftists in the region? And also a little bit the role of AMLO in that, and I guess also Monica can chip in, of course, in the answer.
Yes, thank you, Irene. I think that there might be some ideological convergence. We still have to wait what is going on. Boric is just starting in Chile, not in the best way we were expecting. We need to wait for Petro. We need to wait what happens in Brazil if Lula returns to power. And you have AMLO and you have Alberto Fernandez. You have several left-wing expressions in the region. But when you go into the detail, what I see is that the left thinking in Gabriel Boric in Chile is very much different to the left thinking in AMLO in Mexico. It's a 20th century left thinking against a 21st century thinking, more related to climate change, more related to gender, to 21st century issues, which AMLO is not addressing, or he's addressing in a 20th century perspective. So, yeah. Sorry, Monica?
19th century
or 19th century. If I mean, yeah, we can go backwards to a 19th century nationalist statist perspective. So, and very conservative from a social point of view. So, yeah, both are left wing, but left has many colors within it.
Many shades.
Many shades. Yes,
many shades
exactly.
of pink.
Exactly. So, and at the same time, ideological convergence can be the oil that kickstart the conversation. But at the same time, we have very structural problems going on that goes beyond the ideological dimension. Take China, take the US, take domestic politics in each country, and it's not easy, that conversation. What I see is that we are having different perspective in South America and in Central America, and this includes Mexico, for instance, on how we deal with China. China has different inroads in South America than it has in Central America and in Mexico. I mean, I was very, very interested in the data that Liz shared with us regarding this, how people is willing to stop voting in exchange of public goods. That's the fundamental China model, which is very, is attracting local actors in Argentina, in Brazil, in South America, and it resonates in, in statist, populist, or nationalist collective actors, which see in the China model, a model, I wouldn't say to imitate, to fully imitate it, but it's a point of reference that clashes against a more neoliberal philosophy of development coming from the North. So in the marketplace of ideas, I think that China's inroads should be taken with, in more detail, because are gaining a foothold, and these clashes even within left-wing governments, which are having different perspective on how to deal with China in this case, for instance. So I have mixed feelings regarding this ideological convergence.
So that's a very good point. And if you see, some of the questions we have are really around this convergence and continental unity, and somebody's asking about whether the Pacific Alliance has performed better than previous regional alliances. Monica, we have just 15 minutes left, so just to in a way close a little bit this more regional or pan-regional cooperation. Also China, which, as Federico has also highlighted, is not just a trading partner or economic partner, but is also now is actually exercising its soft power on the domestic level in terms of which kind of type of regime is appealing for citizens. There is also a question on how Latin America is dealing with non-traditional security challenges at the regional level. So back to you, Monica, the same question. How do you see this, the trends for possible more convergence, for a more united voice from I would say potentially more united politically South America, and what is the role of Mexico in all of this?
Unfortunately, I don't see a role for Mexico while López Obrador stays in power. His administration will come to an end in 2 years, and there may be room for a more enlightened leadership, because, as Federico was saying, AMLO is on a completely different setting to the one that Chile, or possibly even Colombia under Petro, will perhaps offer. Antonio Urrejola, the foreign minister of Chile, was herself a member of the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights. So when it comes to human rights, I think that there is room for a view in which, while not giving up a more inclusive conversation that will probably allow Cuba and even Venezuela and Nicaragua to be part, the issue of human rights and democratic standards will not be given up, which is what López Obrador does, because he sees all that as being interventionist. That's why I was saying 19th century. On the non-traditional security agenda, there was a moment of hope again on drug trafficking with Colombia and Mexico back in 2012 to 2016. I don't see that coming back. And I don't see that coming from the US either. And while, as Antonio, the president of the Colombian Commission of Human Rights, highlighted, Francisco de Roo, while the question of development, but also the realization that we have here very powerful illicit economies at play, are not jointly tackled. The way in which drug trafficking has become a major disruptor, even of governability, internal and regional governability, I don't think will find answers. There's the need for enlightened leadership.
Thanks, Monica. Going now, obviously we have seen that the domestic level is very much reflected at the regional level, and some of the fragmentation and polarization challenges come from the domestic level. So if we can go back a little bit to the domestic level, and I guess more a question for Liz and Carlos. Obviously, Liz, you have highlighted these very worrying trends that really people, in a way, seems to prefer to have leaders which are effective, even if they're not democratic, right? So they seem to think, okay, it's fine. I'm happy to go for a trade-off whereby, you know, I get results, but you know, I give up my right to vote, even if they still want to value their freedom of expression very much. So my question, I guess, for you, Liz, would be how sustainable is also this trend in a way, because obviously populist leaders which are now in power have been put there, you know, in the assumption that they will deliver, right? And there are quite a lot of challenges to deliver, as we know, in the region. So do you see that changing again? Do you see preparing or laying the basis for another crisis? And then what's next? I mean, if the populist leaders are not helping, then what's next for the region? And I guess to Carlos more, just given that obviously in the book you have highlighted a number of steps forward, the way to create trust. So I guess these two questions, and really looking at the domestic level and how we can, what are the challenges, what is the outlook, and what can we do to really improve the situation?
Yeah, sure. I'll jump in on that. Although I have to say, I mean, it's the $20 million question, right? I mean, this is the tough question. So I don't have the answer to it. But what I'll say is, when we look at the public opinion data, and this relates to a question that was in the chat, you know, when we see sort of dissatisfaction or disenchantment with standard democratic processes like elections and elected officials, I think what we have to sort of move to at that point is to sort of consider, you know, why is the public so discontent, and what can be done about it? Because the fact that the public is discontent is not necessarily sort of a blemish on the public, right? So if we take Pippa Norris's notion of critical citizens, in a democracy, we want a public that calls out bad behavior. And there's been a lot of really bad behavior, a lot of high-level corruption scandals across the region prior to the pandemic, and then during the pandemic. Cases like Vaccine Gate in Peru, with public officials getting early access to vaccines. I mean, this is just dismaying from the perspective of sort of, you know, wanting to see good governance in the region and this high level sort of good leadership that we'd like to see. So I think, you know, one solution has to lay in the efforts that need to be done to cultivate and incentivize commitment to good governance among elected officials. And that's hard, and that requires leadership. And this then goes back to sort of like the question of where does that leadership come from? Does it come, you know, from within countries, within subgroups within the region or outside, you know, and it connects to sort of this global question of, you know, which model is the model that countries are going to be oriented towards in the future. I'll say that at the public opinion level, that is absolutely an open question, right? People know a lot more about what they don't like and don't want than what they want, right? So they're frustrated with elections. They're willing to give up elections when you give them this trade-off of, you know, elections versus a minimum guaranteed standard of living, but they don't actually know much about China or have high levels of trust in China. We've been asking questions about China for a number of rounds now. And what we see is actually, one, you know, large numbers of people who give no opinion. They just don't have a sense of what China is. And two, declining trust in China among the public. So when we think about this as like, you know, on a global strategic level, I think we have to keep in mind that the conversations that we have as sort of academics and scholars and analysts and policymakers, those are different from the conversations that are taking place among the public. The question within the public is not, you know, China versus US as a model, but really like, you know, what it's just much more sort of proximate to needs and wants and the feelings of what, you know, is not being done, right? So what does the public want? It wants good governance. It wants a voice in politics. And if political institutions and political leaders can be strengthened within a democratic model to provide that, I think the public will be content with that model. But so far as democracy is failing to deliver on those dimensions, it makes democracy quite sort of vulnerable to sort of this public opinion dynamic where the public is open to other models packaged however they may be.
Great point. And Carlos, before you answer, I don't know, you saw there was actually a very interesting question from Antonio Sampaio, a former colleague of mine, on the fact that, you know, you have good governance. Not obviously we focus a lot on the central government, but there are lots of other actors, right, that can help you know, creating trust and also governance. So it talks about local governments, civil society, NGO, and so on and so forth. So just bear it in mind, and I don't know whether in your findings you have also actually you saw a role for these other actors as well. But yeah, if you could just tell us a little bit what could be the way forward, since you have thought quite a lot about that for the book.
Thank you. Oh, it's very interesting because, you know, it may seem that some of the comments, you know, have been disconnected, but actually it's very nice how we can, you know, go in full circle, no? In the sense that, you know, if we don't have trust, we cannot build societies. The type of societies we build and the demands we have for governments tend to be different, you know, and as Liz was saying that very well, and that translates into the regional discussion. So I think it has been a very well-rounded conversation. The issue, you know, why is that we have such a level, you know, low level of trust, you know, and this is not something that happened yesterday, you know, at least for the last 40 years for which we have data, we have seen that, you know, Latin America and the Caribbean has lower trust that, you know, in other regions of the world. You know, I think that we have an original sin in the sense that, you know, our past kind of, you know, has determined our present, you know, clearly colonialism, and the institutions we generated. But just to go to straight to the point, why is that we think that there is mistrust? We synthesize this into reasons. One is that there are huge information asymmetries and huge power asymmetries. So basically, others can take advantage of you when they have more information than you or when they have more power than you. Okay, it's as simple as that. So clearly, you know, NGOs, civil society, local governments, etc., as long as what they are doing is that reducing those power asymmetries and those information asymmetries, clearly they are going to generate more trust. So it's as simple as that. So basically what we do in the book is that we look at all the changes that we can do at every level. You know, clearly, you know, if you think about segregation, you know, very simple thing, something that we do a lot in Latin America, we segregate behind walls. Clearly it's very difficult to trust others, you know, if we don't interact with others. You know, if we have such a different information about each other's. But also with the government, if we don't have information about what the government does, all the information we get is about the latest corruption scandal. So clearly, it's very difficult for us to trust them. And the same regarding power. If you have very little power to do anything, just because institutions are not working, such as the judiciary, the rule of law, but also because we cannot organize a society in order to produce accountability of government, then it's very hard for us to trust those governments. So I think we have done some good things. We have increased transparency, but if we increase transparency but we don't increase accountability at the same time, then we are in a catch-22 scenarios. They say. So just briefly again, I think that the first thing, as we started this conversation, we need to put trust at the center of the policy and political debate. I think we have never considered trust as an objective of public policy. We need to bring trust as an objective, explicit objective of trust of public policy. Every time we take a decision, either political or the public policy, we need to think about the impact that it's going to have on trust. And in order to increase trust, we have to reduce, as we say, those power and information asymmetries. Thank you.
Is it going to be more difficult, you think, taking into account what Liz mentioned as well, and what we heard about the fact that we are in a particularly polarized and fragmented era, I would say, at the political level?
Oh, it is difficult. Clearly, there are plenty of forces that are, making us more apart, since, again, the way we organize a society physically, but also politically, clearly it is. There is a challenge of the role of social media. We are looking at that, but there are ways in which we can move forward. Even social media can be a source of, of cohesion, bringing us together. So the key is to find those objectives and those ways to bring us together instead of, separating us, and particularly in the political arena.
So I just wanted to finish with a question as well. Again, I guess it's for Liz and also for you, for all of you, right? For all of us, I guess. And it's really, taking into account the fact that we seem to be, the people poll seem to sacrifice freedom for stability. And it's something that we have seen, increasingly across the world. Obviously the La Pop survey show how Salvador was number one in terms of tolerance for military coup or military leaders, but also in Peru, which is quite interesting because we've seen that Peru has really gone through a lot of political instability in recent years and months. So I guess the question that Omar has here is really: is there a way to accelerate the maturity process that led to successful democracy model in the West? And I guess that's the big question, right? It's a big question which would help us hopefully create more cohesion domestically, and therefore more cohesion externally, and a better interlocutor for the US and for the rest of the global partners for the region. So, does anyone has if you want, how do we actually accelerate this process of really creating more mature democracy, which I think is a big problem in the region?
Well, I'll jump in and just highlight one thing that I pointed to in the data, and that I think is super important to keep in mind, which is that when we ask people about that type of China model trade-off versus or democracy trade-off, but we focus on freedom of expression, there we see the swing is towards the democratic model when democracy is considered to be freedom of political expression without fear. And I think that's sort of new in this conversation. We focus a lot on sort of people being disappointed with what democracy delivers in terms of material goods or in terms of sort of integrity in leadership, these concerns about corruption. But not a lot on the public's desire for voice. So it kind of suggests that sort of paying people off to support democracy is not the right route, because it's just a game you can't win, right? Because both sides can sort of deliver material goods. But what does democracy have going for it? It has going for it that in theory, it provides people with a means for voice and representation in politics. And so the problem is, and the crisis is, that people don't see it working. right? So if we want to champion democracy, then what we need to do is strengthen institutions so that they actually effectively deliver on what people want. And if and the public opinion data are right, then if democracy delivers on that, we're going to get a lot more goodwill towards that system.
Anyone else? Last word. Great. I think we are actually we're running out of time, and I mean it's a fascinating conversation. I think we could have 4 webinars on one of the different issues, and I think we probably will. But thanks so much. It's been a fantastic and very insightful conversation. I trust our audience has enjoyed it. Thanks so much to Carlos, to Liz, to Monica, and to Federico. And please stay tuned for the next webinar. Bye-bye.